I thought I'd learned to live with being invisible. Years of standing at the edges, holding my tongue, carrying their secrets so they could keep their spotless image. I told myself it was love. Maybe it was. But love can turn heavy, and silence can rot in your chest until it's the only thing you taste. That Christmas, they made it clear there was no place for me at their table. So I decided to bring something of my own, something that wouldn't fit in a box, something that would pull the shine right off their perfect world. What happened after still echoes in that family and in me. Before I tell you, hit like, subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you'd have done if it were your turn to speak. My name is David Miller, and at 62, I've learned how it bends, how nails bite, and how silence can be the sharpest tool in a box. I'm a tall, silver-haired carpenter with hands that carry the memory of every house frame I raised and every cradle I sanded when my children were young. The small wooden place I live in sits just inside the tree line outside Chillicothe, Ohio, where the winter wind has a way of slipping through, seems you didn't know were there. Most mornings I rise before the sun, grind beans in a hand grinder that used to make my wife laugh, brew coffee in a dented kettle, and listen to the forest wake up. On the Tuesday before Christmas, I was tracing a pattern for a custom bookshelf, pencil resting in the groove of my thumb, when the phone buzzed on the kitchen table. The screen lit my knuckles in a thin blue glacier of light. Ryan's name, a short message, and those 7 words, the kind of sentence that seems helpful on the surface and hollow underneath. You don't realize how much space a handful of words can take up until they're the only thing echoing in your house. I stood there for a long minute, chewing on the meaning. Rest at home. It sounded like a favor. It felt like a lock clicking. I wiped the sawdust from my palms and called him, already scripting a gentle way to say I could bring the cookies, the cedar smoked ham, the old ornament box that still smells faintly of peppermint and lemon oil. He answered on the 3rd ring, breath short, typing in the background. Dad, I'm swamped. We're keeping it small, just immediate, you know? You should relax. Roads are bad. We'll do something in January. I reminded him that I was his immediate. He went quiet long enough for me to hear office noise and his jaw flexing. Love you, he said, and then air. There's a particular heaviness to a dial tone when it follows a light lie. I set the phone down and picked up the pencil. The line I drew across the board slipped a hair to the left, just enough to ruin the symmetry. I erased it and tried again, but my hand had that tiny tremor grief brings with it, polite but insistent. I told myself there could be explanations. The kids had colds. The caterer canceled. Maybe the mayor, who bought a desk for me last spring, was dropping by, and security rules were strict. Still, the word family snagged like a splinter, close family only. The next day, I called Megan. She answered on speaker, the sound of glass clinking and a Sinatra song skating in from somewhere behind her. Dad, busy bee day. What's up? I asked about Christmas and heard the smile lift out of her voice. Don't be mad. We're going intimate this year. Ryan's got commitments. The house is like bursting. Maybe we do a brunch next week? You know how these things are. I reach for humor. I can wash dishes, Meg. It's where I won't tell my corny stories. She laughed a little too loud. It's not that. It's just, vibe. The word hung there, weightless and crushing. After we hung up, I walked the perimeter of the property the way I do when a storm's coming, checking shutters, testing the latch on the shed, pretending the easy fixes matter. Snow sifted down, powder fine, settling into the grain of the porch rail. I keep meaning to reseal. I thought about the old ornament box, each trinket a breadcrumb to a different year. Megan's paper angel with crooked wings, Ryan's clay snowman with one eye bigger than the other, the tin bell my wife rang every time the cookies came out of the oven. There's a discipline to being a father that isn't written down anywhere. You show up, even when you've been told you're not necessary. You carry the weight quietly. You build the thing they can stand on, and you step back while they get the applause. But exclusion by euphemism, that's a different craft. It's being told the scaffolding is unsightly now that the facade looks finished. That evening, I made stew the way my wife taught me, browning the meat until it sang, deglazing with a splash of cheap red wine, letting onions melt into sweetness. The house filled with a warmth that pretended to be company. I ate at the counter with the radio on low, a ball game rerun filling the empty spaces, and thought about how holidays used to make time feel wider, like a generous table. Lately, they made it feel narrow, like a hallway you walk alone. After dishes, I dug through the hall closet for the green knit stockings. The one with Ryan's name has a snag near the toe from the year the cat got brave. The one with Megan's name is still dotted with glitter that never really lets go. I laid them on the table, then put them back, slowly, like folding away a season. On Wednesday, I tried not to look at my phone and failed. Ryan posted a photo, a professional decorator threading white lights through a 12-foot fur in his living room. Megan shared a boomerang of champagne flutes clinking under a chandelier. I built the year she opened her shop. The caption read, "The most important people in my life. None of the important people looked like me." I reminded myself this is what grown children do. They build their own centers of gravity. I told myself to be proud that they're confident enough to redraw the map. But pride and pain can share the same chair. Thursday, I drove into town to deliver a toy chest to a young couple expecting their first. I lifted it out of the truck, the cedar smell climbing into the cold air, and the mother to be teared up. "My dad used to make things like this," she said, running her fingers over the dovetail joints. Her husband put a hand on her back and thanked me twice. They followed me to the driveway to wish me Merry Christmas, and I lied like polite men do and said it would be. On the way home, I took the long route, past the high school where Ryan scored his first basket, and I shouted so loud he pretended not to know me, past the park where Megan broke her arm on the monkey bars, and I carried her to the truck while she called me a hero and snot cried into my collar. The sky had that iron color it gets before a big snow. I stopped at the market for milk and cinnamon and nodded at the clerk who's been there. So long we're both running out of ways to say stay warm. Back home, as the first real flakes began to drift sideways, I opened the old cedar chest I keep under the bed. Inside is my private museum. Hospital bracelets, a 7th grade spelling bee ribbon, a tiny oak truck Ryan and I made together out of scrap, the recipe card for my wife's molasses cookies written in her looping hand. I took out the card, read the words I could recite by heart, and set on the counter just to feel her in the room. For a split second, I thought it was an olive branch, maybe an early Christmas card or a token of reconciliation. Instead, when I opened the box, I found a neatly folded Christmas sweater, the same kind they all wore in our family photos, except this one was a size too small, with the sleeves shortened, as if deliberately meant for me to look ridiculous if I dared wear it. Taped to it was a note. "If you decide to stop by unannounced, at least you'll match." The sarcasm hit harder than the cold winter air outside. I set it on the table, staring at it for a long time, my stomach churning. Memories of last Christmas came flooding back. How Megan had insisted on coordinated outfits for the family picture, then handed me a sweater 2 sizes too big, saying it was all they had left. Everyone had laughed at how it swallowed me whole. Back then, I thought it was a harmless joke. Now I saw the pattern. That night, I called Ryan. He picked up after the 4th ring, his voice already tight. "Dad, if this is about the sweater, it's not about the sweater," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "It's about respect." He sighed, the kind of sigh that says he's already written me off as overreacting. "We're just trying to keep things easier this year." "Easier for who?" I asked. "For Megan? For you? Or for the rest of them who'd rather pretend I don't exist?" Silence. Then, "Dad, You've always been a little intense at the holidays. People just want to relax. I bit back the urge to remind him of all the years I worked double shifts to afford those holidays, the way I built every tradition they now enjoyed without me. I hung up before my voice could crack. The next day at the grocery store, I ran into my neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, who asked if I'd be spending Christmas with my kids again. I forced a smile and lied. Of course. Just keeping it small this year. Her eyes softened with that pity I hated, the kind that said she saw through me. Driving home, I passed by Megan and Ryan's house. Lights strung perfectly, a giant inflatable snowman in the yard, silhouettes of people moving inside. For a moment, I imagined walking up the path, knocking, and having Ryan open the door with that startled look he used to get when he was 5 and caught doing something wrong. But I kept driving. That night, I sat in my living room, staring at the darkened corner where the tree used to stand. I hadn't bothered this year. What was the point of stringing lights for no one? Still, my mind kept circling the same question. What had I done to deserve being cut out? The hardware store was nearly empty, the smell of cut lumber and machine oil oddly comforting. I was halfway down the aisle of screws and hinges when I heard my name. It was Mr. Peters, a man I'd known since Ryan was in Little League. He walked over with a grin and clapped me on the shoulder. So, big plans with the kids this year? The question hit like a nail through the sole of the boot. I forced a smile, nodding as if the truth wasn't clawing at the back of my throat. Yeah, just a small one this time. Keeping it simple. He seemed satisfied, but as he walked away, I caught myself gripping the edge of the shelf hard enough for my knuckles to ache. Back home, I unloaded the supplies and went straight to the garage. The rhythmic sound of the saw, the scent of sawdust, and the scrape of sandpaper steadied me. Still, no amount of work could drown out the echo of that question or the lie I'd told. Later that afternoon, the mail arrived. Among the bills and flyers was a small envelope with Megan's handwriting again. My first instinct was to toss it straight into the trash, but something made me open it. Inside was a holiday card, one of those glossy ones families send out with professional photos. Ryan and Megan stood in front of their enormous Christmas tree, both dressed to perfection, the kids in matching outfits, all smiling like a magazine cover. In the bottom corner, written in neat cursive, were the words, "From our family to yours, Merry Christmas." I stared at it for a long time, my eyes catching on the word "our." It was as if I no longer belonged to that definition. No love, dad, or grandpa on the return side. Just Ryan and Megan Miller. No mention of the man who had raised Ryan, who had walked Megan down the aisle, who had paid for the very house they posed in front of. I put the card down, but it kept pulling my eyes back like a splinter you can't help touching. That evening, decided I needed air. I bundled up and went for a walk down the long stretch of road past my house, the snow crunching under my boots. A couple of houses away, I ran into Jeff, a younger neighbor who sometimes borrowed my tools. He grinned when he saw me. "Hey, I heard you kids are throwing some big fancy thing this year. Caterers, live music, the works. That's ought to be fun for you." I kept walking, pretending I didn't hear him. The truth was, hearing about it from other people felt like getting shoved in the chest. Back inside, I stoked the fire until it roared, then sat in my chair, the card from Megan still on the coffee table. It was impossible not to think about all the times I'd been there for them. Fixing Megan's shop sign when the wind tore it down, lending Ryan money for his first apartment, babysitting the kids when Megan needed to meet with vendors. Yet now, I was the one they could leave out without so much as a pang of guilt. The next day, I busied myself fixing a loose board on the porch, but even as I hammered nails into place, my mind kept circling back to the same thought. They didn't just forget me, they had chosen to erase me. Later, while grabbing a sandwich from the diner in town, I overheard two women talking in the next booth. "Did you see the Miller's Christmas party invite?" one asked. "They're saying it's going to be the event of the season." Apparently, they didn't invite half their relatives because Ryan thinks some of them are too old-fashioned. The other woman laughed. Old-fashioned? That's polite for embarrassing. My stomach tightened. I didn't need to ask who they were talking about. I left without finishing my sandwich. By the time I got home, the winter light was already fading, the trees throwing long shadows across the yard. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cardigan. Embarrassing. Was that what they thought of me now? All the quiet sacrifices, the late nights working, the years of putting them first, had all of that been boiled down to a single, dismissive label? I felt something in me settle that night, a kind of cold clarity. Megan's florist account posted a story from her shop. A tower of white poinsettias destined for a private holiday gala, which I recognized by the foyer in the background as their own entryway. A few bubbles later came her caption, "Only the right vibe this year." I should have put the phone away, but the hook was already in. A ping hit my screen from Tom Ellis, an old friend of Ryan's I use to drive to practice. He sent a link to the local lifestyle blog's preview of the Miller's Charity Christmas. I opened it, and there was a glossy mention of Ryan and Megan's elevated family brand, a note about strategic guest curation, and a line that punched the air out of me. No disruptive elements permitted. I wanted to be the bigger man and assumed that meant noisy journalists or uninvited influencers, but the word disruptive tasted like my name. Tom followed up with a message. "You okay with all this PR stuff? Heard some chatter at the firm, something about optics." I typed and erased 3 replies before sending "all good," then sat very still and listened to the clock tick like a hammer far away. I tried to work, but the mallet in my chest wouldn't quiet. So I went to the garage and sanded the cabinet face until the grain shone, the way my wife used to like it, then left it on the sawhorses to breathe. That's when the next piece fell into my lap. My email chimed with a note from a subcontractor, Janelle, a young event coordinator I'd repaired a table for last month. She wrote, "Mr. Miller, quick question. Are you still confirming non-attendance for the Miller event? Their planner sent out a do not admit list, and I wanted to make sure it wasn't a mistake since your name matches." I read the sentence twice and felt the cold rise from the concrete through my boots. I replied with one word, "Forward." And a minute later arrived, an internal message chain, the planner's header bright as a siren, listing deliveries, timing, and then a tidy bullet that stopped my breath. Deny entry to David Miller, father, carpenter, known to default to blue-collar anecdotes. Optics risk with mayor/donors. Under it, smaller, a note I could have gone my whole life without seeing. If he appears, tell security to suggest a later private visit for health and safety reasons. Health and safety, as if I were a loose porch step. I leaned over the workbench and closed my eyes, the weight of that sentence finishing the work the week had started. When I could stand straight, I called Janelle and thanked her for the forward, told her she hadn't caused any trouble and that she shouldn't respond further. She apologized like she'd broken a plate in my kitchen, and I told her plates can be glued if you catch them soon enough. After the call, I went outside and let the cold slap me alert. The yard was a clean white page, my footprints the only story on it. I walked a slow circle and thought about every time I'd stood between my kids' worst decisions and the consequences they'd earned. How quietly I'd carried those moments so their reputations could grow straight and tall. The first came back like a photograph held too close to a light bulb. Ryan at 10, red-faced and scared, confessing that he'd dipped into grandma's change jar for baseball cards, and me choosing a lesson over a spectacle, marching him back to apologize and repay in chores instead of telling his mother and letting the whole house know. Then the memory shifted to Megan at 19, tears in the stockroom of her first rented flower shop after she and a friend knocked over a display and shattered a tray of rental vases. She wanted to blame a part-timer, and I refused to let her. Drove to the wholesaler at dawn, bought new glass out of my pocket, and told the owner I broke them. Those are just the ones with sharp corners. There were softer ones too. Emails I wrote to Ryan's landlord vouching for him when he missed a rent payment. Off-the-books repairs I did at Megan's place when the building inspector was due. The late-night talks where I told them real success meant facing your own mess before the world did. I had always believed that the private repair was the nobler act. Now I understood how easily private repairs can be repackaged as public polish. I went back inside and set water to boil for tea I didn't really want, hand steady because I needed them to be, and scrolled through Megan's page again. Tucked between a wreath tutorial and a selfie with a food blogger was a clip of her laughing with a stylist friend. The caption said, "No more sawdust and sad stories this season. Pure sparkle only." I felt something old and small in me give way. Not a break so much as a conversion, like a knot finally tightening the right direction. It wasn't just that they thought I'd embarrassed them. It was that they decided my entire life, the texture of my hands, the way I talk about work, the history I carry, had become the wrong aesthetic for their narrative. I found myself laughing once, a short sound without humor, because whoever wrote the planner's note had done me a favor I hadn't been able to do for myself. They named the thing. I poured the tea down the sink and called Tom. When he answered, I said, "Tell me what you've heard." He hesitated, then sighed in the way men do when friendship demands a little courage. He said Ryan had been telling colleagues his family was evolving past certain traditions, that he needed clean lines for the press, and that his father meant well but could dominate a room with off-brand stories from back in the day. Off-brand. I thanked Tom and promised I wasn't going to blow up anyone's life, then hung up and stared out the window as a plow carved a bright scar down the road. That night, I stood in the dark of my living room and listened to the refrigerator hum, and I understood that pain sharpens differently once the reason is clear. I wasn't just excluded, I was curated out. I took down the cedar chest from the bedroom closet and opened it on the floor. Inside, the proof of the life they were trying to crop. The letter Ryan wrote at 10 begging me not to tell his mother about the change jar and promising to make it right. The photo of 19-year-old Megan standing in the wreckage of her display before we drove to the wholesaler. The email printout from a landlord who'd given Ryan an extra month because of my word. The repair receipts I'd kept out of habit. Each line item at a time. I showed up without asking anything back. I wasn't gathering blackmail. I was reminding myself I existed. I slipped the letter and the photo into a clean manila folder and labeled it for me, then sat with the chest open until the house was the kind of quiet that makes the bones in the walls creak. Around midnight, I got a text from an unfamiliar number. "Hi, Mr. Miller. It's Ava. I assist the planner for tomorrow." I slipped inside a bookstore next door, pretending to read while positioning myself so I could see them through the window. What I saw made my jaw tighten. My granddaughter Lily, just 6, was there too, sipping hot chocolate with whipped cream piled high. Megan leaned over, wiping a smudge from Lily's cheek, then handed her a shiny red envelope. Lily tore it open, pulling out 2 glossy tickets, her eyes lighting up. I didn't need to hear the words to know. It was the Nutcracker Ballet, something I used to take Ryan to every December when he was little. That was our tradition, one I'd hoped to pass to Lily someday. Watching her bounce in her seat, thanking her mom and dad, was like being punched in the chest. I thought about how easily they'd replaced me in those moments that mattered most. They didn't even look around, didn't think for a second I might be nearby, watching. I left before they finished their drinks, the sound of their laughter chasing me down the street. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the empty seat across from me, remembering when it had been filled with a little boy in a puffy coat, swinging his legs and asking if the sugar plum fairy was real. Now, he was a man who couldn't be bothered to invite me to watch his daughter's eyes light up the way his once did. The injustice of it settled deep in my bones. It wasn't just about missing the ballet or Christmas dinner. It was about being erased from the story entirely. Over the next few days, I thought more about the secrets I'd been holding on to. The late night calls to bail Ryan out when he was 19 and had too much to drink and decided to borrow his roommate's car. The time Megan got fired from her first job for berating a customer, and I used an old contact to make the record vanish before it tanked her career. I never told a soul about those moments, thinking I was protecting them, giving them the chance to grow past their mistakes. But now I saw the truth. They'd built their perfect image on the foundation of my silence. I went into my study and pulled out the old lockbox from the back of the closet. Inside were envelopes, photographs, even a USB drive. The lockbox sat open on the kitchen table, its contents spread out like a crime scene. Every so often, I'd pick up an envelope or a photo and let the memory spool out, reminding myself why I had kept it, why I had never used it before. Each piece was a moment where I had stepped between my children and a truth that would have burned them in ways they weren't ready to handle. But now, the idea that I had protected them only for them to push me out of their lives made my hands itch. On Tuesday afternoon, I drove into town to pick up hardware for the cabinet. As I was leaving the store, I ran straight into Gary Foster, one of Ryan's golfing buddies. He grinned, the kind of grin people wear when they think they know something you don't. "Hey, David. Looking forward to the Millers' big night." My stomach clenched. "Not invited this year," I said flatly. He blinked, then laughed awkwardly. "Oh, yeah. I heard it's a little selective this time. You know how these social things are." I didn't answer. He mumbled something about the weather and hurried off, but I could feel the weight of his embarrassment following me back to the truck. That evening, I made stew and left it simmering while I sat in the living room with a legal pad, writing down a list of names. People who had been present for some of those old incidents. The bartender who'd call me the night Ryan got into a fight over a pool game. The store clerk who had seen Megan try to walk out with a designer scarf when she was 17. The neighbor who knew about the landscaping bill I paid after Ryan's truck tore up someone's yard at a 4th of July party. I wasn't planning to drag them through the mud for sport, but I was done pretending those moments didn't exist. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed. It was a group text, photos of my son's living room, fully decorated for the party. Guests already milling around, champagne flutes in hand. Megan posing with her influencer friends, all of them in glittering dresses. And there, in the background, was Lily holding a tray of cookies like a perfect little hostess. I set the phone down, walked to the garage, and started sanding the cabinet even though it was already smooth. The steady rasp gave me a place to put the noise in my head. But the more I worked, the clearer it became. I didn't just want to be heard. I wanted them to see me, really see me, and know exactly what it cost to erase me. The next morning, I decided to drive past their house, telling myself I just wanted to see how the place looked in daylight. The driveway was full, the street lined with expensive cars. Caterers were unloading trays of food, and I could see the flash of crystal glasses through the open front door. Then, as I slowed, I saw Megan standing at the door with a woman I didn't recognize, pointing toward the street. Megan's lips moved, and the other woman nodded, glancing in my direction. It wasn't hard to guess what she was saying, probably some version of "that's him." I kept driving, my grip on the wheel so tight my knuckles felt like they'd split. Back home, I opened the lockbox again. This time, I pulled out the USB drive. On our voice memos, old ones I'd forgotten about. One was Ryan calling me from a police station at 2 in the morning, begging me to fix it before Megan found out. Another was Megan herself, crying after a bad review from a wealthy client, asking me to post fake positive reviews to drown it out. I had done all. I had been their safety net. And now, in return, I was a liability they wanted to hide. That night, I barely slept. I kept seeing Lily at that coffee shop, holding those Nutcracker tickets, her little face lighting up the same way Ryan's used to when he was her age. I kept hearing Gary's awkward laugh, Megan's whisper to the stranger at the door, Ryan's voice on that old voicemail. By morning, the decision was no longer something I was debating. It was something that had settled into me like the grain in wood. They had chosen their perfect image over the man who built it for them. So I would show them the foundation they were standing on. Not out of spite, but because the truth belonged to me too, and I was done pretending it didn't exist. I spent the day printing a few select items from the lockbox. Nothing that would ruin them beyond repair, but enough to crack the glass they lived behind. As I worked, the snow outside kept falling, a steady curtain between me and the rest of the world. It was quiet, almost peaceful, except for the steady thud of my heart. By evening, I had a neat manila folder ready. The manila folder sat on the kitchen table where I'd left it the night before, a quiet, unassuming thing that seemed almost too small for the weight it carried. I made coffee and sat across from it, studying it the way a carpenter studies a blueprint before making the first cut, knowing that once you start, there's no going back. The folder wasn't just paper and photos and USB drives. It was years of my life, pieces of myself I'd given without asking for anything in return. Every note, every image, every scrap of evidence was a reminder that I'd been there in the shadows, keeping my children's lives smooth while mine grew rough. I thought about the excuses they might make when confronted, how they'd twist the truth, claim they were only trying to protect me or spare me from the stress of a big event. But I also knew their faces when they were caught off guard. I'd seen it when they were kids, the split second of raw honesty before the performance began. That was what I wanted. Not a fight, not a shouting match. Just that moment when they'd realize they couldn't keep the lie going any longer. Around mid-morning, I opened the cedar chest again and pulled out an old Polaroid of the three of us from 20 years ago. It was Christmas morning. Ryan had a toy race car set, Megan a dollhouse, and my wife sat between them, her smile soft but tired. I'd been behind the camera, as always, making sure everyone else was in the frame. Now, decades later, I wasn't even on the same page. I slipped the Polaroid into the folder, not as ammunition, but as proof that I remember a time when family meant something different. By noon, I'd showered, shaved, and put on my one good suit, the dark navy one I usually save for weddings and funerals. It still fit, though the shoulders felt tighter than I remembered. I added a red scarf for warmth and tucked the folder under my arm. Standing at the door, I hesitated for a long moment, listening to the wind push against the siding. My truck sat in the driveway, half buried in snow. I brushed it off, started the engine, and let it warm while I scraped the windshield. The drive into town was slow, the road slick, but I wasn't in a hurry. I didn't want to arrive too early. I wanted the party in full swing when I stepped inside. About 2 blocks from their house, I parked on the side of the road, out of sight, and sat there for a few minutes watching the steady stream of guests. Expensive coats, fur collars, polished shoes stepping carefully on shoveled walkways. From where I sat, I could hear the faint pulse of music and laughter every time the front door opened. It was exactly the kind of event they'd been planning for weeks. Perfect, curated, and untouched by the kind of grit I represented. I waited until I saw a group of people walking up the driveway, then fell in step behind them, blending in just enough that the caterer at the door didn't think to stop me. The warmth hit me first, then the smell of roasted meat, spiced wine, and candles. The living room was packed, the tree glittering with ornaments, the air filled with polite conversation. I caught sight of Ryan across the room, holding a glass of champagne, his arm around Megan's waist. They were both laughing at something a man in a tailored suit had just said. For a moment, I simply watched them, the way I used to watch from the sidelines at their school plays, proud but outside the scene. Then Ryan saw me. The laugh froze on his face, replaced by a quick flash of something else, surprise, then irritation, then that careful, public smile he used when he didn't want people to know what he was thinking. He said something to Megan, who turned, spotted me, and stiffened. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I walked straight toward them, nodding politely to people I didn't recognize. Ryan stepped forward as if to intercept me, his voice low but firm. "Dad, what are you doing here?" I held up a folder, delivering a gift. Megan glanced at it like it was a live grenade. "Now's not the time," she said through clenched teeth. "It's Christmas," I said. "If not now, when?" People nearby had begun to notice, conversations slowing, eyes flicking between us. I could feel the air change, the way it does when a storm rolls in. Ryan lowered his voice further. "We can talk later. Please don't make a scene." I leaned in just enough for only them to hear. "I'm not making a scene. I'm making an introduction." Before they could stop me, I stepped back and raised my voice, not shouting, but loud enough to carry over the music. "I just wanted to say how nice it is to be here tonight." I began, scanning the room, especially since I wasn't supposed to be. A ripple went through the crowd. Megan's hand tightened on Ryan's arm. But I continued. Family is complicated. Sometimes we forget where we come from. Sometimes we rewrite the past to make it look prettier in the present. And sometimes, I held up the folder, we leave out the parts that made the present possible in the first place. No one spoke. Even the music seemed quieter. I didn't open the folder yet. I wanted the silence to settle first, to make sure every single person in that room was paying attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Lily peek out from behind the staircase, her brow furrowed. My voice softened. "This is my gift, not to embarrass anyone, but to remind them, and maybe myself, that the truth is part of the story too." I looked directly at Ryan and Megan. "You built this life, but you didn't build it alone." Megan's smile had frozen into that brittle, glossy look that told me she was calculating 10 moves ahead, but her eyes kept darting to the folder like it was a snake that might strike. I stayed exactly where I was, letting the tension coil. This wasn't about screaming or spectacle. It was about precision, about delivering a truth they couldn't control. Ryan stepped closer, his voice low but sharp. "Dad, take it and leave. Now." I met his gaze without blinking. "If I leave, it stays. And you know what's in it." Megan's nostrils flared, and she glanced around at the guests, her voice tight but coated in sugar. "Why don't we all move into the other room for dessert?" But people weren't moving. They wanted to see what happened next. I could feel it, the way the air gets thick before a storm. Slowly, I opened the folder. I didn't dump it out. I pulled out one item at a time, holding it just long enough for the nearest people to catch a glimpse before placing it on the table. First was the photo of a teenage Megan in the wrecked shop display, her eyes red from crying. Then came a printout of the police report from the night Ryan had borrowed his roommate's car without permission. Charges never filed because I'd made the right calls. A murmur went through the room. I could see the ripple traveling outward as guests craned to see. Ryan's jaw worked like he was grinding glass between his teeth. "You're humiliating yourself," he said under his breath. "No," I replied. "I'm reminding you." Megan reached for the folder, but I placed my hand over it. "Not yet." Next, I held up a letter, Ryan's 10-year-old handwriting begging me not to tell his mother about the coins he'd taken from Grandma's jar. People smiled faintly at that. Some even chuckled, until I added, "He paid it back in chores." That's how you learn. At least, that's how you used to. Megan's face was pale now, and she glanced at the staircase where Lily was still peeking down. I softened my tone just a notch. "Your kids deserve to know you didn't start perfect. None of us did." I laid the letter gently beside the other papers. The final item I pulled from the folder was the USB drive. I didn't explain it, just placed it in the center of the table. "This one," I said, "is for you too, not for everyone else." but you'll listen to it before the year's over, or I will make sure someone else does. That was the only direct threat I allowed myself. The rest, I let hang in the quiet that followed. People shifted uncomfortably, not sure whether to look at me, at Ryan, or at the growing pile of history in front of them. Finally, I spoke again, not to them, but to the room. Families are built on truth, even the messy parts. Especially the messy parts. You don't get to cut someone out and pretend the scaffolding never existed. Tonight isn't about revenge. It's about balance. You've had your picture-perfect version of things long enough. Now you remember the rest. I stepped back from the table. Ryan looked like he might say something, but his lips pressed into a thin line instead. Megan reached for a glass of water with hands that trembled just enough for me to notice. And then something unexpected happened. One of their guests, a man I didn't know, but who clearly knew them well, stepped forward. "David," he said, "I had no idea." His voice was calm, not judgmental, but it landed like a stone in the pond. Others murmured agreement. The social armor Ryan and Megan had worn all night began to crack. Megan's mother, who had been standing near the tree, came over and looked through the papers. She didn't say a word to me, just turned to her daughter and said, "Why didn't you ever tell me this?" Megan's mouth opened, then closed again. Ryan muttered something about not wanting to make a scene, but it was too late. The scene was already made, and not by me, by the truth sitting in plain sight. I picked up my coat from the back of a chair. "I won't stay for dessert," I said, my voice steady. "You've got enough to chew on." There was no applause, no outburst, just that heavy, awkward silence people make when they know the story has shifted in a way they can't undo. I left the folder on the table, walked to the door, and let myself out into the cold. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew I'd just set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. I didn't regret it, not for a second. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual and made coffee, sitting at the kitchen table while the phone buzzed with missed calls and unread texts. I didn't touch it. If they wanted to talk, they could leave a message. Around 10, I heard the crunch of tires on snow outside. I looked through the blinds and saw Ryan's SUV parked at the curb, the engine still running. He sat there for a minute before finally getting out, his breath visible in the cold. He didn't knock hard, just one sharp rap on the door. I opened it and stepped aside. He came in without taking off his coat, his eyes scanning the kitchen like he was trying to find the right place to start. "That was low," he said finally. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that told me he'd been rehearsing this since last night. "No," I said, "low is pretending your father doesn't exist because he doesn't fit the picture you want to show off." His jaw tightened again. "You embarrassed us in front of people who have nothing to do with any of that. Those people," I said, "only know the version of you that's been edited. Maybe it's time they see the uncut footage." He rubbed his forehead. "You don't understand what it's like trying to keep everything together in front of investors, clients. I understand perfectly." I cut in. "I kept everything together for you for years. I just didn't invite the press to watch me do it." He didn't have a comeback for that. For a long moment, we just stood there, the sound of the refrigerator filling the space between us. Finally, he said, "Lily saw some of it. She had questions." His voice softened when he said her name. I kept my own voice steady. "Then answer them and tell her the truth, not the PR version." He stared at me for another moment, then turned and walked out without another word. I watched from the window as he got into the SUV and drove off, the tires throwing up a spray of slush. Not long after he left, my phone lit up again, this time with a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and Megan's voice came through, clipped and cold. "You had no right." I let her finish the sentence before I replied. "I had every right. You don't get to erase me and expect me to sit quietly. You've ruined relationships we've spent years building," she said. "No," I told her, "I've shown them the foundation under those relationships. If it's solid, it'll hold. If it's not, it was going to crack anyway. She didn't respond to that. I heard her inhale sharply, then she hung up. By that afternoon, the ripple had started to spread. A friend from the hardware store texted me, heard about the party. Bold move. My neighbor stopped me when I went to get the mail, shaking his head with a mix of disbelief and something like admiration. Guess they won't try to leave you out next year, he said. I didn't answer him, but the corner of my mouth lifted. 2 days later, a small envelope arrived in the mail with no return address. Inside was the Polaroid I'd put in the folder, along with a short note in Megan's handwriting. We didn't forget. We just didn't remember right. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was something. The same day, I got an email from Ryan with no subject line. It contained only one sentence. Lily wants to see you before Christmas. I read it twice, then a third time, letting the words settle. It didn't erase what had happened. It didn't change the fact that they'd cut me out until I forced my way back in. But it was a start. That evening, I went into the garage and picked up the cabinet I'd been working on. I sanded the edges, smoothed the corners, and thought about how it could be scarred and still hold strong if you know how to work it. I didn't know what the next week would bring or whether the cracks in my family could be repaired. The snow had stopped falling by the morning of Christmas Eve, leaving the world outside my window still and bright, the kind of cold that makes the air feel clean when you breathe it in. I woke before sunrise, not out of habit or restlessness, but because I knew today would be different. On the kitchen counter sat a small bag with Lily's name written in red marker. Inside was a wooden music box I'd made by hand, the lid carved with a nutcracker dancer. It played a tune I'd hummed to Ryan when he was her age, the same tune he'd once asked me to play just one more time until he fell asleep. I wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with twine, the way my wife used to wrap gifts when money was tight, but care was abundant. Around 10, Ryan's SUV pulled up in front of the house. This time he came to the door without hesitation, and when I opened it, Lily stood beside him in a red coat and knitted hat. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and her smile was cautious, like she wasn't sure what she was walking into. "Hi, Grandpa," she said softly. I knelt down, so we were eye level. "Merry Christmas, Lily. I've got something for you." I handed her the package, and she peeled the paper back carefully, revealing the music box. When she opened it and heard the tune, her eyes widened. "Daddy said you made this?" she asked. "I did," I said, "and I used to play that song for him when he was little." She turned to Ryan, who gave a small nod. "It's true," he said quietly. There was a pause then, one of those moments where the air between people changes shape. Ryan glanced at me, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something in his expression that wasn't guarded. It was closer to the boy who used to come running to me after school, chattering about his day. "We're going to Megan's for dinner tonight," he said. "You should come. Lily wants you there." The offer hung in the air like a fragile ornament, and I weighed it carefully. Part of me wanted to say yes instantly, but another part knew that walking back into their curated world so soon might undo more than it fixed. "Not this time," I said gently, "but maybe next week we can have dinner here. Just us. No cameras, no guests, no perfect pictures. Just family." Ryan nodded slowly, and I could tell he understood. Lily hugged me then, her small arms warm around my neck. "Merry Christmas, Grandpa," she whispered. I watched them drive away, the music box balanced on her lap, the melody faint even through the closed car door. Inside, the house was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty. I made myself coffee and sat at the table, looking at the bare spot where the lockbox had been. I'd put it away the night before, not because I was finished with it, but because I didn't need it to speak for me anymore. The truth had been told. The damage and the healing were now theirs to manage, not mine to hide. As the day went on, I thought about how easy it is to disappear in plain sight. Not because people stop seeing you, but because they start looking only at the parts they want to. And I realized that showing up at that party hadn't been about revenge. It had been about refusing to be edited out of my own story. I'd spent years being the quiet fix, the invisible foundation, the one who made sure the walls stood straight while others got the credit for the view. Now, even if the relationship with my children was still uneven, even if there were cracks that might never close, I was back in the frame. Not the perfect, polished frame they'd wanted, but the real one. And that was enough. As the sun set, the sky turning pink over the snow, I lit the fireplace and sat in my armchair, letting the warmth reach my hands. Somewhere in town, Ryan and Megan were probably hosting another flawless evening. But somewhere else in that same town, a little girl was opening a music box and hearing a song that tied her to something older, something true, something she couldn't see in a photograph. That was my quiet victory. Not applause, not vindication, but the knowledge that I was still part of the story, no matter how they try to write it. Families can hide their flaws, but they can't erase the people who built them. And as long as I was here, I'd make sure my place was never invisible again. The end. If you made it all the way to the end of my story, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribed so you won't miss the next one. I'd love to hear what you think. Was I right to walk into that party with the truth, or should I have kept my silence? And what would you have done in my shoes? Also, tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment, and it means a lot to see how far these stories travel.